When you think of medieval rulers, whose faces come to mind? Kings in shining armor, perhaps, or warlords leading armies across bloodied battlefields. But what if I told you some of the most brilliant strategists, fearless leaders, and visionary builders of that era weren't men at all? History books have quietly erased the legacies of queens and empresses who ruled with unmatched cunning, who brokered peace through diplomacy when swords failed, and who constructed thriving cities while others waged war. These women didn't just exist in the margins, they shaped empires, rewrote the rules of power, and then were systematically forgotten. Why? Because their stories threatened the very foundations of the world they lived in. Picture this: a queen charging into battle, armor glinting, her army roaring behind her, or a teenage ruler outmaneuvering seasoned politicians with nothing but her wit. These aren't exceptions, they're chapters of history we've been taught to ignore. For centuries, chroniclers minimized their achievements, attributing their successes to luck or the men around them. But the truth is far more fascinating. These women didn't just participate in history, they bent it to their will. They navigated a world designed to suppress them, turning obstacles into opportunities with breathtaking audacity. Some wielded swords, others wielded influence so potent it toppled dynasties. Their methods differed, but their goal was the same: to rule, and to rule unforgettably. So why does their absence from our collective memory matter? Because when we ignore these stories, we don't just lose tales of individual brilliance, we lose the full tapestry of human history. These rulers weren't anomalies, they were proof of what women could achieve even when every system was stacked against them. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on 25 of these extraordinary figures. You'll meet warriors who led armies to victory, tacticians who outsmarted invading forces, and visionaries who built cultural landmarks that still stand centuries later. By the time we're done, you'll see the medieval world not as a parade of kings, but as a stage where women fought, schemed, and governed their way into legend. Ready to reclaim what history tried to erase? Let's begin. The medieval world wasn't just a stage for kings and knights, it was a chessboard where queens made their moves with precision. While history paints this era as a time when power rested solely in the hands of men, the reality was far more nuanced. Behind the scenes, and often right on the throne, women were pulling the strings of empires, negotiating treaties, and even leading armies into battle. Think about that for a moment. In an age when women were supposedly confined to castles and convents, some were rewriting the rules of power entirely. Take regents, for example, mothers who ruled in place of their young sons until they came of age. These women weren't just placeholders, they were masterful politicians who held kingdoms together during turbulent times. Imagine the skill it took to navigate court intrigue, fend off scheming nobles, and maintain stability, all while being constantly scrutinized for stepping outside traditional roles. And then there were the queens who ruled outright, their authority unquestioned. They didn't just inherit power, they wielded it with such force that their reigns became legendary. Yet for centuries, their stories were downplayed or erased. Chroniclers of the time, often monks or court historians, framed their achievements as exceptions rather than the norm. A queen's military victory credited to her generals, a regent's economic reforms attributed to her advisors. Even when their accomplishments were undeniable, they were painted as anomalies, as if brilliance in leadership was something women could only achieve by accident. But modern historians are unraveling these biases, digging past the myths to uncover the truth. What they've found is astonishing. Female rulers weren't rare flukes. They were a consistent, formidable force across medieval Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. From the Byzantine empresses who governed with unmatched shrewdness to the warrior queens of Africa who led armies into battle, these women didn't just participate in history, they shaped it. And the more we learn about them, the clearer it becomes. The medieval world was far more complex and far more fascinating than we've been led to believe. In the rugged highlands of 13th century Armenia, one woman stood defiant against the tide of Mongol conquest. Queen Isabella wasn't just a ruler, she was a battlefield commander, a strategist who outmaneuvered one of history's most fearsome empires. When her husband died, leaving her a widow in a world where remarriage meant surrendering power, she made a radical choice. She would rule alone. No second husband to claim her throne, no male regent to whisper in her ear. Just Isabella, her sword, and an unshakable determination to protect her people. The Mongols, at the height of their expansion, expected easy submission. What they got was a queen who met them on the field. Isabella didn't just barricade herself in castles, she led charges, rallied her knights, and forged alliances with neighboring kingdoms that turned the tide. Her genius wasn't just in combat, it was in diplomacy. She played rival factions against each other, securing treaties that bought Armenia precious time to fortify its defenses. Contemporary chronicles describe her riding through campfires at night, inspecting troops with the sharp eye of a seasoned general. Yet for all her achievements, Isabella's name faded from history. Why? Because her very existence shattered stereotypes. A woman leading men into battle, a widow refusing to relinquish power. These truths unsettled later historians who preferred tales of damsels in distress. Even the Mongols, who respected strength above all else, acknowledged her prowess. Their own records speak of the Lioness of Armenia, who made them bleed for every inch of land. Isabella's legacy isn't just about battles won, it's about rewriting the rules. In an era when queens were expected to mourn quietly, she roared. While other rulers fell to Mongol hordes, she held the line for decades, proving sovereignty wasn't about gender, it was about grit. Today, as archaeologists uncover fragments of her fortified cities, we're finally piecing together the full portrait of a queen who refused to be erased. While warriors like Isabella defended borders with swords, another kind of ruler was reshaping an empire with the power of ideas. Meet Theodora Porferogenita, the scholar-empress who turned Constantinople into a beacon of learning during Byzantium's darkest hour. In the 11th century, as rival factions tore at the empire's edges, Theodora did something radical. She invested not in armies but in books. While most medieval rulers measured strength in conquered territories, she measured it in illuminated manuscripts and philosophical debates. Theodora's court became a sanctuary for thinkers. She reopened the University of Constantinople, which had crumbled under neglect, filling its halls with the greatest minds of the age: astronomers from Persia, legal scholars from Italy, mathematicians from Alexandria. But her influence wasn't just about patronage. She actively participated in intellectual life, penning treatises on statecraft that blended ancient Greek philosophy with practical governance. Imagine a ruler who could quote Aristotle while drafting tax reforms, or debate theology between imperial audiences. That was Theodora's genius. She understood that an empire's true power lay in the wisdom of its people. Yet later historians reduced her to a puzzling footnote. Some called her a recluse, as if her love of study implied weakness. Others framed her scholarly pursuits as eccentric hobbies, ignoring how her policies stabilized Byzantium's economy and revived its cultural prestige. The truth: Theodora's reign marked the beginning of the Byzantine Renaissance, a flowering of art and scholarship that would last centuries. The very schools she founded became nurseries for the thinkers who preserved classical knowledge while Europe languished in the so-called Dark Ages. What makes Theodora's story so vital isn't just her brilliance, it's the way she redefined leadership itself. In a world obsessed with conquest, she proved that nurturing minds could be as transformative as winning battles. While other rulers' names survive in dusty chronicles of wars fought and lost, Theodora's legacy lives on in the ideas she championed. The next time you marvel at the intricate mosaics of Hagia Sophia or trace the roots of the Renaissance, remember, behind those achievements stands an empress who knew that the greatest empires are built not on land but on thought. Off the stormy coast of Western Ireland, where the Atlantic crashes against sheer cliffs, a legend was born, not in some mythical past, but in the turbulent 16th century. Grace O'Malley wasn't just any chieftain. She was the pirate queen who turned the sea into her kingdom. While most noble women of her time were confined to castles and courts, Grace stood on the decks of her ships, salt spray in her hair, commanding a fleet that struck fear into the hearts of English merchants and rival clans alike. Her name in Gaelic, Grain Emhail, meant bold grace, a nod to the childhood act of cutting her hair short to sneak aboard her father's ships, defying tradition before she'd even reached adulthood. What made Grace extraordinary wasn't just her prowess at sea, though that was undeniable. She could outmaneuver English warships in the treacherous currents of Clew Bay, using her intimate knowledge of every hidden cove and rocky outcrop. It was her political genius that set her apart. When the English crown tightened its grip on Ireland, crushing Gaelic lords one by one, Grace didn't just resist, she sailed straight into the lion's den. In 1588, at the height of England's power, she demanded an audience with Queen Elizabeth I herself. Picture the scene, the pirate queen, unapologetic in her Gaelic dress, standing toe-to-toe with the most powerful monarch in Europe. While English courtiers whispered about this barbarian woman, Grace negotiated in Latin, the language of diplomacy, securing freedom for her imprisoned sons and the right to rule her lands without interference. Elizabeth's own records reveal her grudging respect for Grace, calling her a woman of stout courage. Yet English chroniclers couldn't resist painting her as a savage, a caricature meant to justify their conquests. The truth, Grace was a master of both sword and strategy. When her first husband was murdered by a rival clan, she didn't retreat into mourning. She rallied her forces and reclaimed his castle. When the English governor scoffed at dealing with a woman, she blockaded his port until he begged for terms. Even in her 60s, she led raids, proving that age and gender were no match for sheer will. Grace's legacy isn't just in the ballads sung along Ireland's coast. It's in the way she redefined power itself. In a world where women's voices were often silenced, she spoke, and the world listened. Today, as historians uncover ship logs and letters that detail her shrewd alliances, we're seeing past the English propaganda to the real Grace, a ruler who knew that true strength lies not in brute force, but in the audacity to claim your place at the table, even if you have to sail through a storm to get there. In the bustling streets of 13th century Delhi, where silk-clad merchants haggled over spices and scholars debated in shaded courtyards, a ruler emerged who defied every expectation. Raisia al-Din didn't just break the glass ceiling, she shattered the entire structure. As the first and only woman to ascend the throne of the Delhi Sultanate, she didn't plead for acceptance. She commanded it, striding through court in a warrior's tunic and turban, her very presence a challenge to the old order. This wasn't mere symbolism. Raisia governed with a revolutionary vision. While most rulers of her time squeezed peasants dry with oppressive taxes, she abolished them entirely for farmers struggling after monsoons. Instead of filling her council with noblemen's spoiled sons, she appointed officials based on talent, promoting a Hindu convert to Islam as her finance minister, a move that scandalized the aristocracy. Imagine the audacity. In an era where bloodlines dictated power, Raisia insisted that skill mattered more than surnames, but her reforms came at a cost. The nobles who'd grown fat on privilege couldn't stomach being upstaged by a sultan who wore skirts beneath her armor. They whispered that a woman's place was in the harem, not the halls of power. Even her own stepmother conspired against her, proving that the fiercest battles Raisia fought weren't on the battlefield, but in the gilded corridors of her palace. Yet for all their scheming, her enemies couldn't deny her competence. Raisia personally led troops to quell rebellions, her tactical brilliance turning certain defeats into victories. When her treasury ran low, she didn't raise taxes, she audited corrupt officials, recovering stolen gold with the precision of a master accountant. Even the Persian ambassador, who expected to patronize a mere figurehead, left his audience with her stunned into silence, later writing that she debated law and philosophy like Aristotle reborn. Raisia's downfall came not from failure but from success. The more effective she proved, the harder the old guard fought to tear her down. Betrayed by a trusted general during a campaign, she was captured and, in a final twist of irony, forced into marriage with her captor, the ultimate humiliation for a woman who'd spent her life refusing to be any man's pawn. Within months, she was dead, her reign cut brutally short at just 3 years. But here's what her enemies failed to erase: her legacy. The tax reforms she implemented survived her, lifting countless farmers from poverty. The scholars she patronized went on to see Delhi's intellectual golden age, and though later chroniclers tried to reduce her to a cautionary tale, see what happens when women rule. The people remembered. For generations, mothers in Delhi whispered Raisia's name to their daughters as they stitched rebellion into bedtime stories. Today, as historians sift through crumbling ledgers and rediscover her edicts, we're finally hearing the truth. The greatest threat Raisia posed wasn't to tradition, but to injustice. And that's why they couldn't let her stand. While European monarchs fretted over palace intrigues, a queen in Southwest Africa was waging a war that would shape continents. Enzinga of Ndongo and Matamba didn't just resist the Portuguese slave trade. She turned their own greed against them with the cunning of a chess grandmaster. Picture this: a diplomatic meeting in 1622, where Portuguese officials pointedly offered the visiting queen no chair, expecting her to kneel like a supplicant. Without missing a beat, Enzinga motioned to one of her attendants, who dropped to hands and knees, becoming her living throne. In that single act, she revealed her playbook, turning humiliation into power, forcing her enemies to underestimate her right before she outmaneuvered them. For 40 years, Enzinga fought colonization not just with spears but with psychological warfare. When Portuguese forces pushed her from Ndongo's capital, she didn't retreat. She conquered neighboring Matamba and rebuilt her army. She armed runaway slaves, turning Portugal's human cargo into her fiercest warriors. She even temporarily converted to Christianity, adopting the name Dona Ana de Sousa to secure European allies, then discarded the facade when it no longer served her. The Portuguese, who'd expected a pliable puppet, found themselves facing a ruler who studied their tactics, exploited their rivalries with the Dutch, and matched their firepower by trading ivory for guns. Contemporary European accounts paint her as a bloodthirsty schemer, but their own correspondence betrays their grudging respect. One frustrated captain wrote that Enzinga fights like a man and governs like a woman, revealing the paradox that terrified them. She combined battlefield ferocity with political brilliance. While other African kingdoms fell to divide and conquer tactics, Enzinga united former rivals, offering sanctuary to displaced tribes and weaving a coalition that stretched across the region. Her spies infiltrated Portuguese forts, her envoys played the Dutch against the English, and her refusal to surrender, even in her 70s, forced Portugal to the negotiating table. The true measure of her impact, where neighboring regions crumbled under colonial rule within decades, Enzinga's lands remained independent until the late 19th century. The delay wasn't just a military victory. It allowed Ndongo and Matamba to preserve their culture, their traditions, and their people's freedom for generations longer than anywhere else on Africa's western coast. Today, as Angolan schoolchildren learn her story, they're not hearing a tale of resistance, they're learning the blueprint of a queen who proved that the sharpest weapon isn't a sword, but a mind that refuses to be conquered. History remembers kings, but power often flowed through quieter hands like those of Margaret Legen-Hufford, the Swedish noblewoman who mastered the art of ruling without a crown. Officially, she was just a regent governing in her young son's name during the 1500s. Unofficially, she was the chess player moving every piece on Sweden's political board while men claimed the credit. Picture a frosty Stockholm morning where councillors arrived at court expecting to manipulate a grieving widow only to find Margaret already 3 steps ahead, her network of spies and allies rendering their schemes useless. What made Margaret extraordinary wasn't just her tactical brilliance, though that was undeniable. It was her ability to make her influence invisible. While male regents flaunted their authority, provoking rebellions, Margaret wielded power through whispers. She played rival factions against each other with such subtlety that both sides believed she favored them. When the nobility demanded privileges, she granted just enough to keep them loyal, but never enough to weaken the throne. And when foreign ambassadors sought to exploit Sweden's interim government, they left perplexed, their carefully laid plans unraveled by a woman they dismissed as a placeholder. The proof of her mastery lies in the chaos that followed her death. Within months, the fragile stability she'd maintained collapsed into infighting, proving how much Sweden had relied on her unseen hand. Yet for centuries, historians attributed her successes to male advisors until archivists uncovered her private letters. These documents reveal a ruler who micromanaged everything from tax reforms to military deployments, her handwriting filling margins with sharp critiques of incompetent generals and wasteful spending. One particularly revealing note to her son's tutor reads, "Let him study Machiavelli, but remind him his mother mastered these arts before he was born." Margaret's legacy isn't in statues or grand decrees. It's in the blueprint she left for wielding power in a world determined to deny it. Where other female rulers fought for recognition, she thrived in the shadows, turning perceived weakness into her greatest strength. While queens like Elizabeth I shaped history through visible glory, Margaret proved that sometimes the most enduring power is the kind no one notices until it's gone. Among the thundering hooves of Mongol cavalry, where warriors earned respect through strength and skill, Kuchalan didn't just participate, she dominated. Granddaughter of the legendary Kublai Khan, she rode into battle not as some symbolic figurehead, but as a commander whose strategic brilliance matched her raw physical power. Picture a woman in full armor, her long hair whipping behind her as she charged enemy lines, her father's troops following without hesitation. This wasn't rebellion against Mongol traditions, it was the purest expression of them. In a society that revered martial prowess above all, Kuchalan didn't ask for acceptance, she seized it through sheer excellence. Her legend began not on the battlefield, but on the wrestling mat. Mongol nobles competed in Burk, a brutal form of wrestling where victory demanded strength, agility, and unshakable nerve. Kuchalan didn't just enter these contests, she dominated them, tossing seasoned warriors onto their backs with effortless grace. Soon, her reputation grew beyond mere sport. She turned wrestling into a political weapon, declaring she'd only marry any man who could pin her. The catch: losers forfeited their finest horses. Marco Polo, who witnessed her matches firsthand, wrote that she amassed a herd of 10,000 steeds from defeated suitors, a fortune that funded her own private army. But Kuchalan's true genius lay in translating physical dominance into military authority. When her father, Kaidu, waged war against Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty, she wasn't relegated to some ceremonial role. She planned campaigns, led charges, and once reportedly snatched an enemy commander from his saddle during a skirmish, dragging him back to her father's tent like a trophy. Contemporary accounts describe how rival armies, upon hearing Kuchalan's distinctive war cry, would break formation before the fighting even began. Yet for all her fame in life, Kuchalan's story was quietly erased from official Mongol histories after her death. The reason: she threatened the very foundation of a changing empire. As the Mongols shifted from nomadic conquerors to settled rulers, her refusal to marry and her insistence on ruling in her own right became an inconvenient truth. Later chroniclers recast her as a cautionary tale, painting her independence as eccentricity rather than strength. Some even claimed she eventually married to quell rumors, though no historical records confirm this. What makes Kuchalan's legacy so enduring isn't just her defiance of expectations, but how perfectly she embodied Mongol ideals while shattering gender barriers. In a culture that measured worth by capability, she proved that greatness wasn't about being a man or woman, it was about being unstoppable. Today, as historians comb through dusty caravan records and Persian manuscripts for traces of her influence, we're rediscovering a truth the empire tried to bury. The greatest wrestler in Mongol history wasn't just a princess. She was the warrior who pinned an entire worldview to the mat. In the heart of medieval Italy, where emperors and popes clashed for supremacy, one woman held the purse strings that could tip the scales of power. Matilda of Tuscany wasn't just a countess, she was Europe's most formidable banker-stateswoman, a financier who kept the papal army solvent and emperors on their knees. While kings measured strength in castles, Matilda understood the real currency of influence: cold, hard silver. Her ledgers didn't just balance accounts, they dictated who sat on thrones and who knelt in penance. Picture the year 1077, when Holy Roman Emperor Henry Roman IV stood barefoot in the snow outside Canossa Castle, begging Pope Gregory Roman VII for forgiveness. What history books often omit is that the castle belonged to Matilda, and the entire dramatic showdown unfolded on her terms. She'd bankrolled Gregory's reforms, turning her Tuscan fortresses into papal strongholds. When Henry marched south to crush the rebellion, he didn't just face excommunication, he faced Matilda's economic blockade. Her control of trade routes through the Apennines starved his army of supplies, while her loans kept the Pope's allies armed. By the time Henry reached Canossa, he wasn't just surrendering to spiritual authority, he was surrendering to the woman who held his empire's financial lifeline. Matilda's genius lay in leveraging wealth as political weaponry. She didn't just donate to the church, she structured her loans like modern bonds, with castles and land as collateral. When bishops needed funds to resist imperial forces, she provided them with interest rates that expanded her influence with every repayment. Her account books, meticulously preserved in monastic archives, reveal transactions that would make modern investment bankers blink. Loans equivalent to millions in today's currency, secured against future tax revenues, with clauses ensuring papal protection for her territories. Yet within decades of her death, chroniclers reduced this financial titan to a footnote: the pious Countess Matilda. a devoted widow who supposedly spent her days embroidering altar cloths. The truth, she never remarried after her husband's death precisely to avoid losing autonomy over her fortune. Even the famed donation of Matilda, where she willed her lands to the papacy, was likely a political maneuver, a final chess move to keep emperors from seizing Tuscany after her death. Modern historians poring over her estate records have uncovered something astonishing. Matilda didn't just fund the investiture controversy, she profited from it. Every castle she gifted to the church came with strings attached, ensuring her family retained control. Every loan to a bishop strengthened her network of loyal vassals. And when the dust settled, it was Matilda's signature on the treaties that reshaped medieval Europe's power structure, not as a passive witness, but as the architect who financed the entire conflict. The lesson hidden in her story isn't just about forgotten female power, it's about how history erases women's economic agency. Matilda didn't wield a sword, she wielded compound interest. And in the end, her balance sheets proved mightier than any emperor's army. In the fevered chaos of the Crusader states, where knights and emirs clashed over holy ground, one woman turned a throne into an oasis of stability. Melisend of Jerusalem wasn't just a placeholder ruler, she was the architect of a cultural renaissance in the midst of war. Born in 1105 to the Frankish king Baldwin II and his Armenian queen Morphia, Melisend inherited not just a crown, but a fractured kingdom perpetually on the brink. The Crusader nobles expected her to marry quickly, produce an heir, and fade into the background. Instead, she transformed Jerusalem into a glittering capital that outshone even Damascus. Her first masterstroke was turning the Church of the Holy Sepulchre into a political stage. While her father and husband waged endless battles, Melisend commissioned mosaics so breathtaking that pilgrims swore angels had crafted them. She expanded the shrine with a new chapel, her name etched into its stones alongside biblical kings, a deliberate message that her authority came not from marriage but divine right. Art became her diplomacy. When Muslim envoys visited, they weren't shown armories but libraries stocked with Arabic manuscripts Melisend had collected. In a land where every interaction was a calculated move, her patronage disarmed enemies more effectively than swords. But her greatest battle wasn't against Saracens, it was against her own husband, Fulk of Anjou. The moment Baldwin died, Fulk tried to erase Melisend from charters, replacing her seal with his own. What followed was medieval politics at its most brutal. Melisend didn't raise armies, she weaponized loyalty. The same Armenian and Syrian Christian nobles Fulk dismissed as foreign upstuffs became her staunchest allies. When Fulk imprisoned her chief advisor, she didn't beg, she let Jerusalem's streets erupt in riots until her husband backed down, humiliated. By 1143, Fulk was dead in a suspicious hunting accident, and Melisend ruled unchallenged, her name alone on every edict. Modern historians have pieced together the truth behind her golden age. Tax records show she slashed military spending to fund hospitals and scriptoriums. Pilgrim accounts describe a queen who personally distributed alms to lepers, her veil damp with perfume to mask the stench, a calculated display of piety that undercut critics calling her unnaturally bold. Even her infamous ambition was reframing. While male rulers conquered cities for glory, Melisend secured Jerusalem's survival through trade pacts with Damascus and Byzantine marriage alliances. The bitter irony, the very chroniclers who praised her father and husband for their battle scars condemned Melisend for her unwomanly statecraft. When her son Baldwin III tried to seize power prematurely, monks wrote that she clung to authority like a man, as if competence had a gender. Yet it was Melisend's treaties that kept Jerusalem standing long after the Crusader kingdoms crumbled. Today, As restorers uncover her frescoes beneath layers of Ottoman plaster, we're rediscovering the truth. The greatest defender of the Holy Land wasn't a warrior in chainmail, but a queen who knew that culture could conquer where armies failed. The sagas whispered of them for centuries, women who stood shoulder to shoulder with Viking warriors, their swords just as sharp, their voices just as commanding. Historians long dismissed these accounts as mere legend, insisting Norse society had no place for battle-hardened women. But in 2017, a gravesite in Birka, Sweden, silenced the skeptics forever. There, buried with a sword, axe, and 2 shields, lay the remains of a high-ranking Viking commander. DNA testing confirmed what the artifact suggested. This was no man, but a woman who'd led armies to glory. Suddenly, the mythical Lagertha wasn't just a character from TV dramas. She was a reflection of a truth we'd refused to see. Viking society wasn't the hyper-masculine world pop culture portrays. Norse law codes from Iceland to Denmark show women inheriting land, initiating divorces, and yes, taking up arms when circumstance demanded. The sagas brim with shield maidens like Herva, who retrieved her father's cursed sword from his grave, or Freydis Eiriksdottir, who reportedly fought off Native American warriors while pregnant, swinging a sword with one hand and cradling her belly with the other. These weren't just stories, they were cultural memories preserved in poetry, hinting at a reality where women's roles were far more fluid than medieval Europe could comprehend. What's most revealing isn't just that women fought, but how they were remembered. In the saga of the Volsungs, when Brynhilda teaches the hero Sigurd warfare, the text never questions her authority. It's assumed a woman would master strategy as naturally as weaving. Contrast this with later medieval chronicles, where scribes sanitized similar figures into tragic lovers or witches. The Viking world celebrated female ferocity. Christian Europe pathologized it. Yet even the Norse had their contradictions. While sagas praised shield maidens, real-life warrior women likely occupied a complex space, respected but rare, celebrated yet still exceptions. Recent excavations reveal graves where weapons and jewelry mingle, a Sikh's dagger buried with amber beads or a spear laid beside silver brooches. These finds suggest battle wasn't a woman's primary role, but neither was it forbidden. When crisis came, societal rules bent. A widow defending her farm, a chieftain's daughter leading retaliatory raids. These were not aberrations, but accepted extensions of Viking pragmatism. The greatest distortion lies in how modern retellings strip these women of agency. Lagertha becomes a love interest rather than a sovereign queen. Shield maidens are depicted as rebels defying norms, when in truth, they operated within a system that allowed, if not encouraged, their prowess. By reducing them to romantic plot devices or feminist icons, we miss the deeper lesson. The Vikings judged people by capability, not chromosomes. In a world where survival demanded every able hand, dismissing half the population's potential wasn't just immoral, it was stupid. Today, as archaeologists dust off more graves and linguists decode runic inscriptions with fresh eyes, we're piecing together a Viking age far richer than the horned helmet cliches. The shield maidens remind us that history rarely fits into tidy boxes, and that sometimes the most revolutionary truth isn't that women could be warriors, but that no one at the time found it particularly remarkable. England in the late 14th century was a tinderbox of religious tension, and at the center of the storm stood an unlikely revolutionary, Anne of Bohemia, the queen who dared to shelter heretics. When she arrived in London as Richard II's bride in 1382, the court expected a docile foreign princess. What they got was a scholar fluent in 3 languages, carrying banned religious texts in her trousseau. While English bishops hunted down Lollard preachers radicals who challenged church corruption and translated the Bible into English, Anne turned her chambers into a sanctuary, hiding fugitives behind tapestries and slipping them funds from her privy purse. Her protection of these reformers wasn't just charity, it was strategic defiance. The Lollards' demands accessible scriptures, an end to clerical greed mirrored reforms sweeping Anne's native Bohemia, where her father, Emperor Charles IV, had nurtured religious debate. At Westminster, she hosted underground salons where scholars read Wycliffe's translations aloud, their words dissected by candlelight. When Archbishop Courtenay demanded she cease, Anne countered by publicly distributing bread to the poor alongside Lollard priests, forcing the church to either arrest their queen or tolerate her charitable works. The nobility sneered at her Bohemian whims, but London's commoners adored her. While other royals traveled with armed escorts, Anne walked the city's plague-ridden slums with only a maid pressing coins into lepers' hands and listening to grievances. Chroniclers noted how crowds followed her, not to beg but to hear her recite scripture in their own tongue, a brazen act when Latin was the church's guarded domain. Her popularity became her shield. When Courtenay finally accused her of heresy in 1389, Richard dared not confront her, knowing the riots that would follow. Anne's sudden death from plague in 1394 sparked an outpouring of grief so intense it unnerved the establishment. Mourners flocked to her tomb at Westminster Abbey, leaving offerings and copying the Lollard verses carved discreetly into its base. Within months, the church whitewashed those inscriptions, burned her personal library, and purged her allies. Yet traces of her influence lingered. The Lollard movement she nourished would resurface decades later, fueling the fires of the English Reformation. What makes Anne's story so compelling isn't just her courage, it's how she weaponized femininity itself. By framing reform as women's piety, she exploited the church's own reverence for maternal virtue. Where male reformers faced execution, Anne's unassailable role as queen consort let her push boundaries no man could. Today, as historians decode her confiscated letters, coded references to the Bohemian light, hidden between lines of embroidery patterns, we're rediscovering a ruler who didn't just challenge authority, but outmaneuvered it with velvet-gloved hands. In the fractured kingdoms of 13th century Iberia, where Christian and Muslim rulers clashed over every inch of soil, one woman stitched together the future of Spain not with a sword, but with a wedding contract. Berenguela of Castile didn't just arrange her son Ferdinand's marriage. She orchestrated the unification of Leon and Castile through sheer diplomatic finesse, averting a civil war that could have splintered the peninsula for generations. While kings measured power in battlefield victories, Berenguela wielded something far more potent, the ability to make enemies sit at her table and leave as allies. Her mastery of statecraft began in crisis, when her father, Alfonso VIII, died suddenly in 1214. Berenguela found herself trapped between warring factions, her own brother Enrique's regents on one side, ambitious nobles hungry for land on the other. While others panicked, she played the long game. Recognizing that her toddler brother's reign was doomed, she didn't waste troops defending a lost cause. Instead, she quietly built alliances with Leon through her sister's marriage, planting the seeds for future unity. When Enrique died in a freak accident crushed by a falling roof tile, Berenguela didn't seize the throne for herself, though by Castilian law she could have. She made the brilliant calculation to abdicate in favor of her 17-year-old son Ferdinand, knowing that as his chief advisor, she could rule without the target a queen regnant would wear. What followed was a political ballet unseen in medieval Europe. Berenguela negotiated the Treaty of Los Tercerias, ending 60 years of conflict between Castile and Leon by betrothing Ferdinand to Princess Beatrice of Swabia. This wasn't just a marriage, it was a geopolitical masterstroke. The union neutralized German claims to Iberian lands while securing papal support against the Almohad Caliphate. Contemporary chronicles record how she drafted the treaty's clauses herself, inserting provisions that gave Castile control over key Leonese fortresses. Even the wedding feast became political theater. Berenguela seated Moorish emissaries beside Christian bishops, signaling that Spain's future lay in coexistence, not crusade. Yet for all her achievements, male historians reduced her to the mother of kings, as if her genius lay in childbirth rather than statecraft. The truth. Ferdinand's legendary conquests, the fall of Cordoba, the siege of Seville, were bankrolled by tax reforms Berenguela implemented and planned in war councils she chaired. When nobles rebelled, it was her network of informants that uncovered their plots. When the church demanded crusading funds, she diverted them to build hospitals along pilgrimage routes, earning public goodwill that shielded her son's reign. The greatest testament to her skill lies in what didn't happen. While France and England tore themselves apart in dynastic wars, Berenguela's Spain emerged united, its kingdoms bound not by force but by her meticulous web of marriages and treaties. Today, as scholars revisit her handwritten correspondence, pages filled with sharp analysis of grain prices and garrison placements, we're discovering the real architect of medieval Spain's golden age. Not a warrior king clad in armor, but a queen who knew that the strongest empires aren't forged in battlefields, but in the quiet rooms where futures are negotiated. Mary of Guelders didn't just wait, she waged war. When the English captured her husband, King James II of Scotland, in 1460, they underestimated the quiet woman left to govern his kingdom. While other regents might have focused on maintaining the status quo, Mary saw an opportunity. Within months, she transformed from a consort into a commander, raising armies not just to defend Scotland, but to strike back. Picture this, a queen hunched over battle maps in Edinburgh Castle, her fingers tracing invasion routes into northern England while her counselors warned of retaliation. She didn't flinch. Mary's brilliance lay in her dual strategy. She fought on both military and economic fronts. While Scottish forces harried English border towns, she secretly funded the Wars of the Roses, funneling money to the Yorkist faction to keep England too divided to focus on Scotland. Contemporary account books reveal astonishing entries, shipments of silver labeled wool exports that mysteriously reached rebel camps, and loans to Yorkist lords secured with nothing but their gratitude. At the same time, she fortified Scotland's defences, upgrading castles with innovative artillery placements that would later prove decisive, but her masterstroke was psychological. Instead of pleading for James's release, Mary made his captivity England's liability. She allowed rumours to spread that without the king, Scotland might ally with France, England's eternal rival. The threat wasn't empty. Her correspondence with Louis XI of France, recently uncovered in Parisian archives, shows detailed plans for a joint invasion. Faced with war on two fronts, the English blinked first, releasing James in 1463 after 3 years of captivity. The cruel irony: the moment James returned, Mary's authority evaporated. Chronicles from the period show her signature vanishing from state documents, her military advisors suddenly dismissed. James even revoked her control over key castles, gifts he'd granted before his capture. Yet the records tell another story, one the chroniclers missed. Tax rolls from the 1460s reveal that the Queen's personal estates continued funding border garrisons long after James resumed power. Court rolls show her intervening in legal disputes, her judgments respected even when unofficial. Mary hadn't been sidelined, she'd simply shifted tactics, ruling through influence where direct command was denied. What makes her story so haunting isn't just the injustice, it's how systematically her achievements were reframed. Later historians, uncomfortable with the idea of a woman outmaneuvering England, recast her as a devoted wife acting on her husband's behalf. Even the spectacular ransom negotiations, where Mary secured James's freedom without ceding an inch of Scottish soil, were attributed to male diplomats. Only now, as scholars pore over her household accounts and intercepted diplomatic letters, are we seeing the truth. Scotland didn't just survive James's absence, it thrived under Mary's rule. The lesson hidden in her ledger books and fortifications isn't about lost glory. It's about power's quiet persistence. Mary of Guelders proved that leadership doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers from the margins, reshaping history even when the spotlight turns away. And in those whispers, if you listen closely, you can hear the real story of a queen who refused to be erased. In the rose-scented gardens of 14th century Shiraz, where Persian poets competed to craft the most exquisite verses, one voice rose above them all, and it belonged to a queen. Jahan Khatun didn't just rule her city, she reigned over its literary soul, composing poetry so luminous that even her rivals whispered it must have been divinely inspired. Imagine a royal court where the evening's entertainment wasn't feats of arms or falconry, but recitations of ghazals so tender they brought hardened warriors to tears. That was Jahan Khatun's world, a place where politics and poetry intertwined like the vines in her palace courtyards. Her verses pulsed with a rare duality, weaving together the sacred and the sensual. One moment, she'd pen lines comparing a lover's beauty to the moon over the Zagros Mountains. The next, she'd draft biting couplets about the burdens of power, likening her crown to a golden chain that chafes the brow. This wasn't mere ornamentation, it was statecraft in meter. When rebellious nobles questioned her authority, she didn't send soldiers. She hosted a poetry contest, knowing her quatrain would outshine theirs, proving her intellectual superiority. In an era when Persian women were often confined to the inner quarters, Jahan Khatun turned the royal diwan into a stage, her words disarming critics more effectively than any army. Yet her brilliance became her undoing. When her cousin overthrew her in 1387, the new regime didn't just strip her of power, they erased her from literary history. Scribes carefully scraped her name from manuscripts, attributing her poems to male contemporaries like Hafez, who'd actually been her protege. For centuries, scholars assumed the delicate handwriting in certain divans belonged to a male scribe, never imagining a woman could craft such masterful calligraphy. The irony, some of Persia's most beloved verses about feminine beauty and strength were actually written by a woman, one who knew those subjects intimately. The rediscovery of Jahan Khatun's original manuscripts in the 1960s sent shockwaves through academic circles. Here, in faded but unmistakable ink, were marginal notes in her hand, correcting her poems as they appeared in Hafez's collected works. Even more telling were the personal seals pressed beside certain verses, royal insignias that no mere scribe would possess. Linguists analyzing the texts found subtle markers of female authorship, metaphors drawn from women's daily rituals, references to childbirth woven into spiritual allegories. These weren't the forgeries historians initially suspected. They were the work of a ruler who'd mastered the art of speaking truth through layers of metaphor. What makes Jahan Khatun's legacy so vital isn't just the injustice of her erasure, it's how perfectly she embodied the paradox of female power in medieval Persia. Her poetry could describe the ecstasy of divine love in one stanza and the loneliness of command in the next, revealing a ruler acutely aware of her precarious position. In a haunting verse penned after her deposition, She compared herself to a nightingale caged by those who still demanded her song. The tragedy: that cage was built not just by enemies, but by time itself. Generations of historians who couldn't conceive that Persia's sweetest verses might have flowed from a queen's pen rather than a courtier's. Today, as scholars digitize her surviving works, we're witnessing something extraordinary: the reassembly of a shattered mirror. Each rediscovered poem reflects not just Jahan Cotton's genius, but the broader truth about how many women's voices have been silenced by the assumption that brilliance must wear a beard. When you read her lines about the rose that blooms defiant between palace cracks, you're not just encountering medieval poetry, you're hearing the whisper of a queen who knew her words would outlast the kingdoms that tried to bury them. France in the early 1500s was a kingdom tearing itself apart, and at the center of the storm stood a queen branded a traitor for centuries. Isabella of Bavaria didn't just inherit a crown, she inherited a war, a mad king, and a court seething with factions hungry for power. While history remembers her as the woman who sold France to the English during the 100 Years' War, the truth hiding in dusty archives tells a far more complex tale. This wasn't betrayal, it was survival. Picture the impossible choices Isabella faced. Her husband, Charles VI, suffered bouts of psychosis so severe he didn't recognize his own family, leaving France without a functioning ruler. Their son, the Dauphin, was a child caught between warring uncles, the Dukes of Burgundy and Orleans, each willing to burn the country to ash for control. With England's Henry V hammering at the gates, Isabella did something radical. She played the long game. Secret letters intercepted by scholars reveal her clandestine negotiations with both the English and Burgundians, not to surrender France but to buy time. Every treaty signed under duress, every concession whispered in shadowed chambers, was calculated to keep her son's throne intact until he came of age. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which famously declared Henry V heir to France, wasn't the act of a traitor, it was a stalling tactic. Isabella knew the English king would never live long enough to enforce it. He died 2 months later. Meanwhile, she funneled funds to loyal commanders holding key fortresses and smuggled messages to her son's supporters. Contemporary accounts from Burgundian spies complain of the queen's womanly guile, how she promised one thing to their faces while working against them behind closed doors. Even the English found her frustratingly evasive. One envoy wrote that negotiating with Isabella was like grasping smoke, yet the propaganda machine of the victorious Valois dynasty needed a villain. To justify their eventual reconquest of France, they rewrote history, casting Isabella as a foreign harlot who'd betrayed the realm. Chroniclers erased her desperate attempts at reconciliation between factions, instead painting her as scheming with the Burgundians at lavish banquets while France bled. The most damning accusation, that she declared her own son illegitimate to strengthen English claims, was an outright fabrication, disproven by surviving legal documents where she fiercely defended his birthright. Modern historians examining her household records find a different story. Ledgers show Isabella quietly paying ransoms for captured French knights. Correspondence with the University of Paris reveals her lobbying to protect scholars from political purges. Even in exile, she negotiated the return of stolen religious relics to Reims Cathedral, understanding their symbolic importance to French morale. This wasn't the behavior of a traitor, it was the strategy of a ruler trying to salvage a kingdom from collapse. The tragedy of Isabella's legacy isn't just the slander, it's how effectively her pragmatism was recast as weakness. Where male rulers waging civil war were forgiven as doing what was necessary, a queen making brutal compromises to prevent total annihilation was framed as monstrous. Today, as scholars decode her ciphered letters and reconstruct her burned diaries, we're finally seeing the real Isabella, not France's betrayer, but the woman who held its shattered pieces together long enough for Joan of Arc's miracle to take root. In the end, her greatest crime wasn't treachery, it was refusing to let idealism doom her son's future, and for that, history made her pay. The wind howled through the valleys of Legen-Hufford in 1136, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and rebellion. Gwenllian Furch Griffith wasn't supposed to be on that battlefield. Noblewomen of her time were meant to wait safely behind castle walls while men fought. But when Norman forces swept into Wales, burning villages and seizing land, Gwenllian made a choice that would echo through centuries. With her husband, Prince Griffith ap Rhys, away seeking alliances, she took up his sword and rallied what remained of their forces. Picture her standing atop a rocky outcrop, her cloak whipping in the storm as she addressed farmers turned soldiers in their native Welsh. Better to die defending our homes than live as slaves on our own soil. What happened next wasn't just a skirmish, it was a reckoning. Gwenllian led a daring raid on Kidwally Castle, hoping to strike before Norman reinforcements arrived. But the attack was betrayed. Ambushed in the shadow of the fortress, her outnumbered troops fought desperately as Gwenllian herself cut down knights with a battle axe later described as taller than a harvest scythe. Contemporary Welsh accounts describe her fighting with one hand while using the other to shield a wounded boy until a Norman lance found her heart. The victors left her body in the mud as a warning, but they underestimated the power of her sacrifice. The real tragedy wasn't Gwenllian's death, it was the systematic erasure that followed. Norman chroniclers dismissed her as a misguided woman who'd strayed from her place, while Welsh bards immortalized her as Why Dywysoges Loss, the Blue Princess, a spectral figure said to haunt battlefields where Wales was threatened. Her legend grew precisely because official records tried to bury her. When her sons Morgan and Maelgwn later slaughtered the Norman garrison at Kidwally, they reportedly raised her battle cry, Dros Gymru a Mam. For Wales and Mother, modern archaeologists have uncovered something astonishing near the presumed battle site, a 12th century silver brooch engraved with a unique knotwork pattern matching descriptions of Gwenllian's wedding jewelry. Forensic analysis revealed it had been clutched in someone's hand so tightly the design imprinted on their flesh before being lost in the mud. This small, twisted artifact tells us more than any chronicle. Gwenllian wasn't just a symbol. She was a woman of flesh and blood who gripped her convictions until the end. What makes her story resonate isn't just the bravery, it's the layered erasure. English historians reduced her to a footnote, Victorian poets romanticized her into a weeping maiden, and even today, some dismiss her as mere legend. But the Welsh never forgot. During Owain Glyndwr's 15th century uprising, rebels painted her blue and white colors on their shields. In the 1980s, miners striking against Thatcher's policies invoked her name as they picketed. Gwenllian's true legacy isn't in how she died, but in how her defiance became a language of resistance, one that whispers through the centuries whenever the powerful assume the powerless will stay silent. The year was 983, and the Holy Roman Empire teetered on the edge of chaos. Emperor Otto II lay dead after a disastrous campaign in southern Italy, leaving behind not just a grieving widow, but a Byzantine princess who would become the empire's unlikely savior. Theophanu arrived in the West as a teenage bride, her silk gowns and jeweled headdresses sparking whispers about her foreign excess. Yet when crisis struck, this so-called outsider would prove more capable than any native-born noble. With her 3-year-old son Otto III crowned but helpless, Theophanu didn't just assume the regency, she reinvented it, blending Byzantine statecraft with Germanic traditions to create a new model of power. Her first act was pure political theater. Instead of hiding behind veils like proper imperial widows, Theophanu presided over court in full imperial regalia, her signature purple chlamys sweeping the floor as she received ambassadors. This wasn't vanity, it was a calculated message. By adopting the visual language of Byzantine emperors, she projected unshakable authority at a time when rival dukes questioned whether a woman, let alone a Greek one, could hold the realm together. Contemporary chronicles describe how she silenced muttering nobles by producing her marriage contract, which explicitly granted her co-ruler status. Then came her masterstroke. She turned her foreignness into an asset. While German lords squabbled over local power, Theophanu's connections to Constantinople opened trade routes brimming with Byzantine gold and silk, stabilizing the economy. What truly set her apart was her cultural diplomacy. Theophanu transformed the imperial court into a bridge between East and West, introducing Byzantine mosaics to German monasteries and replacing crude wooden chapels with soaring stone basilicas. Artisans from Constantinople taught local craftsmen the lost art of cloisonné enamel, creating treasures like the stunning Lothar cross that still dazzles visitors to Aachen Cathedral. Even something as mundane as the fork, an object Theophanu famously brought from Byzantium, became a subtle tool of soft power. At state banquets, her elegant use of this decadent utensil shamed rough-handed nobles into adopting more refined manners, slowly reshaping court culture. Yet for all her achievements, Theophanu faced relentless opposition. Churchmen like Bishop Theodora of Mersburg condemned her for Eastern decadence, accusing her of importing silk cushions when the empire needed swords. What these critics missed was her military acumen. When Henry the Quarrelsome, Duke of Bavaria, rebelled in 984, Theophanu didn't send generals. She led negotiations herself, isolating Henry by promising his allies tax exemptions drawn from her Byzantine coffers. The revolt collapsed without bloodshed, a feat no warrior king had managed. The greatest irony of Theophanu's reign lies in what happened after her death in 991. While her political role was minimized by later historians, one medieval scribe reduced her to the mother of Otto. Her cultural revolution endured. The illuminated gospels she commissioned became templates for Armenian art. The Greek medical texts she imported formed the core of Salerno's famed medical school. Even her son's later obsession with reviving the Roman Empire likely stemmed from childhood memories of his mother's Byzantine splendor. Modern archaeologists have uncovered tantalizing clues about her influence. Lead seals bearing her name found as far as Venice prove her far-reaching trade networks, while chemical analysis of 10th century German stained glass reveals Byzantine cobalt pigments tangible evidence of her artistic legacy. Theophanu's story isn't just about a regent holding power. It's about how the very qualities that made her suspect, her gender, her foreign birth, became instruments of transformation. Where others saw weakness, she found strength in difference, proving that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to become what others expect. And though history tried to recast her as a footnote, the light filtering through a Byzantine-style stained glass window in Cologne Cathedral still tells the truth. Empires aren't just built on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when a woman from afar decides to teach a new world how to shine. In the sun-drenched courtyards of 10th century Cordoba, where the scent of citrus trees mingled with the ink of scholars, one woman's mind outshone them all, yet you've likely never heard her name. Lubna wasn't just another scribe in the caliph's glittering court. She was the architect behind one of the Islamic world's greatest treasures, the Royal Library of Medina Azahara. Picture this, a young woman, daughter of a slave, rising before dawn to copy Euclid's geometric proofs by lamplight. her quill racing against the sunrise. By day, she navigated palace corridors with arms full of parchment, debating algebra with poets and correcting astronomers' calculations in the margins. This wasn't just study, it was a quiet revolution. What set Lubna apart wasn't merely her brilliance, it was her role as the living bridge between cultures. Fluent in Latin, Greek, and Arabic, she didn't just preserve ancient texts, she resurrected them. When a water-damaged manuscript of Archimedes arrived from Constantinople, it was Lubna who painstakingly reconstructed its smudged diagrams, adding her own annotations that later scholars would mistake for those of a male peer. Her translations of Plato's dialogues became standard texts in Andalusian madrasas, yet scribes often omitted her name, attributing the work to generic, wise men of Cordoba. Even more extraordinary was her mentorship. Historical payroll records list payments to male students under her tutelage, an astonishing detail proving she didn't just share knowledge, she was paid to impart it as a recognized teacher. The tragedy came in flames. When Berber rebels sacked Medina Azahara in 1010, they didn't just burn books, they erased the fingerprints of genius. Lubna's personal anthology of women's poetry, her treatise on spherical trigonometry, her correspondence with Baghdad scholars, all turned to ash. For centuries, historians assumed Andalusia's intellectual golden age was solely a male achievement, until a chance discovery in a Cairo synagogue's Geniza. There, wedged between prayer books, lay a letter from a Jewish merchant thanking the learned Lubna for resolving a complex inheritance dispute using algebraic principles. The document's mundane nature, a business receipt, proves how deeply her expertise permeated daily life. Modern researchers are piecing together her legacy through faint traces. Marginalia in surviving manuscripts contain phrases like, "as the woman explained," or "per the calculation method of the palace scribe," coded references to Lubna's methods. A 12th century Persian geometer's notebook describes learning the Andalusian technique for calculating pi, a method later traced to Lubna's reconstructed work on Archimedes. Even the library's catalogue, once assumed destroyed, survives in fragments showing her meticulous classification system, an early form of the Dewey Decimal that grouped texts by subject and language rather than the era's chaotic shelving. The cruelest irony, Lubna's near erasure wasn't medieval misogyny alone. It was the collateral damage of empire. When Christian chroniclers recounted Cordoba's fall, they celebrated the library's destruction as a blow to Moorish decadence, never imagining its chief architect was a woman. Islamic historians, eager to portray the Umayyads as enlightened rulers, emphasized male scholars to seem serious to rival dynasties. Lubna fell through these cracks, too accomplished to ignore but too anomalous to celebrate. Today, as digitization projects reassemble the library's scattered fragments, we're discovering the truth. The light of Andalusia's golden age burned brightest not in some bearded sage lamp, but in the quick hands of a woman who knew knowledge was no one's monopoly. Her real monument isn't in parchment or stone, it's in the very idea that genius wears no gender. When you see a modern textbook reducing medieval science to a parade of male names, remember Lubna's story. Remember that history's silence speaks volumes about who gets to be remembered and who does the remembering, and perhaps, just perhaps, let that awareness kindle a fire no army can extinguish. In the glittering courts of 15th century Europe, where kings gambled with kingdoms like chess pieces, one woman played the long game and won. Margaret of York wasn't just a royal sister or a duchess by marriage. She was the unseen architect of Burgundy's golden age, a strategist whose marriage alliances redrew the continent's power map. While men clashed on battlefields, she fought with parchment and promises, turning wedding vows into unbreakable treaties. Picture this, a young English princess, raised on tales of the 100 Years' War, arriving in Burgundy to marry its duke. Within months, she wasn't just adjusting to her new role, she was rewriting the rules of diplomacy. Margaret's genius lay in recognizing what others missed, that bloodlines could be stronger than battle lines. When her husband, Charles the Bold, fell at Nancy in 1477, leaving Burgundy vulnerable between France and the Holy Roman Empire, she didn't retreat into mourning. She transformed grief into leverage. With no surviving son, her stepdaughter Mary became the prize every king coveted. Louis XI of France demanded Mary marry his heir, while Emperor Frederick III pressed for a Habsburg union. Margaret turned their hunger into an auction, playing France against Austria until she secured terms that kept Burgundy autonomous. The eventual marriage to Maximilian of Habsburg wasn't just a match, it was a masterstroke that would echo through history, planting the seeds for an empire where the sun never set. But Margaret's influence didn't stop at the altar. She built a spy network so extensive that Venetian ambassadors complained their dispatches reached her before their own doges. When French agents tried to bribe Burgundian nobles, she intercepted their letters, then leaked them to stir anti-French sentiment, her most daring move. Secretly funding English pretenders to distract Louis XI, keeping him too busy to swallow Burgundy whole. Account books from the period reveal staggering sums labeled "for the king's cousin," code for supporting Henry Tudor's invasion, which would eventually place her nephew on England's throne. Later historians, uncomfortable with a woman wielding such quiet power, reduced her to Margaret the Matchmaker, as if arranging marriages was some domestic hobby rather than high-stakes statecraft. The truth hides in plain sight in the portraits she commissioned, where she stands not beside her husband, but holding a charter of Burgundy's liberties, her gaze steady as a general's. Modern scholars combing through Habsburg archives have uncovered her marginal notes on treaties' entire clauses rewritten in her precise hand, proving she didn't just witness history, she drafted it. The ultimate testament to her foresight, that Habsburg marriage she orchestrated. Within 2 generations, her grandson Charles V would rule an empire spanning Spain, Germany, Italy, and the New World, a realm so vast it made Burgundy's survival inevitable. Margaret never lived to see it, but she didn't need to. She'd already planted the seeds, knowing empires aren't built in a day, but in the quiet moments when a woman chooses the right names for a wedding contract. And in those inked letters, she ensured Burgundy wouldn't just endure, it would shape the modern world. The crown they placed on Jadwigur's head in 1384 wasn't just heavy, it was a revolution in gold and jewels. At 10 years old, she wasn't merely crowned Queen of Poland. The nobles declared her Rex, Latin for king, a deliberate choice to silence any doubt about her authority. This wasn't symbolism, it was survival. With Hungary and Lithuania circling like wolves, Poland needed a ruler who could command armies and broker alliances, not a consort waiting for a husband to legitimize her. What followed wasn't just a reign, but a masterclass in how piety and power could intertwine. Jadwigur's first act defied every expectation. Instead of marrying for personal gain, she turned her betrothal into geopolitical alchemy. When her fiancé, Wilhelm of Austria, arrived in Krakow, the Polish nobility barred him at the gates, fearing Habsburg influence. Most princesses would have wept. Jadwiger seized an axe and hacked at the palace door, not in rage but to stage a calculated protest. The message was clear: she'd play the political game, but on Poland's terms. Months later, she agreed to wed Jogaila of Lithuania, a pagan duke whose conversion would unite 2 kingdoms into a superpower. The Union of Kruo didn't just create Europe's largest state, it neutralized the Teutonic Knights, whose crusades had bled both nations dry. But Jadwigur's true genius lay in her dual identity. By day, she ruled with the pragmatism of a seasoned diplomat, establishing trade routes that stretched from the Black Sea to Flanders. At night, she knelt barefoot on icy chapel floors, her prayers so fervent that attendants claimed her feet left bloodstains on the stone. This wasn't just devotion, it was statecraft. When rebellious nobles questioned her authority, she didn't send soldiers. She walked into their strongholds with nothing but a crucifix, forcing them to either kneel or face the wrath of their superstitious peasants. Her patronage of learning reveals another layer of strategy. The university she founded in Krakow wasn't just a charitable act, it was a weapon against the Teutonic Order's intellectual dominance. By training Polish and Lithuanian scholars in law and theology, she ensured her fledgling union could outmaneuver its enemies in debates as well as battles. Professors received salaries from her personal treasury, while students from humble backgrounds found doors opened by her decree. The same hands that signed death warrants for bandits also traced delicate illuminations in her prayer books, a duality that fascinated and unnerved contemporaries. The tragedy of Jadwigur's legacy isn't that she was forgotten, it's how she was remembered. Canonized in 1997, her sainthood overshadowed her political brilliance. Church chronicles highlighted her charity. She once gave her jewels to fund a hospital, but glossed over her shrewdness in appointing bishops who'd back her policies. Modern historians digging through treasury records tell a different story. The Holy Queen maintained a network of spies in every major court, her pious pilgrimages often coinciding with military mobilizations. Even her early death at 25 remains suspicious. Some accounts suggest poisoning by opponents of Lithuanian integration. What makes Jadwigur's story so compelling isn't just the blurring of sacred and secular power, it's how she weaponized that ambiguity. In a single lifetime, she proved that a ruler could negotiate with merchants at dawn, pray with mystics at noon, and outwit emperors by dusk. The university she founded still stands today, its oldest lecture hall bearing a peculiar feature, a small window where Jadwigur would allegedly listen unseen, ensuring the scholars she funded spoke truth to power. It's the perfect metaphor for her reign, a woman watching, learning, and shaping history from the shadows, even as the world tried to box her into either a saint or a sovereign. In truth, she was always both. High in the mountains of 15th century Ethiopia, where the air was thin enough to touch the heavens, Empress Eleni wasn't just ruling, she was playing chess with empires. When Portuguese ships appeared on the Red Sea coast, their cannons trained on her kingdom, most monarchs would have reached for their armies. Eleni reached for parchment. Her brilliant stroke, a letter to Pope Nicholas V, penned in flawless Latin and sealed with a cross of gold, an invitation to ally against their common enemy, the rising tide of Islamic sultanates. But this wasn't mere diplomacy. It was a masterclass in leveraging faith as a shield. By positioning Christian Ethiopia as Rome's spiritual sibling, she transformed potential invaders into protectors, securing Portuguese military aid without surrendering an inch of sovereignty. What made Eleni extraordinary wasn't just her political cunning, it was her vision for a modern Ethiopia. While European visitors expected a backward kingdom, they found roads paved with precisely cut stone, a network of way stations for travelers, and a royal court where scholars debated astronomy in Arabic, Amharic, and Greek. Venetian merchant logs from 1482 describe her commissioning a map so accurate it guided Portuguese navigators around the Horn of Africa, drawn by Ethiopian cartographers using astrolabes of her own design. Yet her greatest innovation was bureaucratic. She established the first permanent foreign ministry in sub-Saharan Africa, training diplomats in the art of silent negotiation, where concessions were never given, only traded. The bitter irony, while Portuguese chroniclers like Francisco Alvarez praised Eleni as the wisest ruler the Indies ever knew, many African histories reduced her to a pious footnote. The reason lies in the politics of memory. Later Ethiopian emperors, eager to emphasize masculine military glory, downplayed her diplomatic triumphs. Arab traders' records, uncomfortable with a Christian woman outmaneuvering Muslim rivals, attributed her successes to male advisors. Even the stunning rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, which Eleni restored and expanded, became credited solely to male predecessors until recent archaeology uncovered her insignia hidden in their frescoes. Modern researchers piecing together her legacy face a startling revelation. Eleni's greatest feat wasn't just preserving Ethiopia's independence, it was shaping global history from an African throne. The Ethiopian-Portuguese alliance she brokered redirected European colonial ambitions away from the highlands for centuries, allowing the kingdom to flourish as the only African nation never colonized. Dig through Vatican archives today, and you'll find her handwritten marginalia in a rare Coptic Bible gifted to the Pope, notations that reveal a ruler equally versed in theology and realpolitik. The lesson hidden in her ink-stained pages: true power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it writes letters so compelling that would-be conquerors become allies, and history's pen trembles in its hand. The sagas called her and the deep-minded, but history nearly erased her genius until now. In 9th century Iceland, where glaciers loomed like frozen titans and volcanoes simmered beneath thin soil, this Norse matriarch did something revolutionary. She carved justice into law. While most remember Viking society for raids and longships, Un's legacy was quieter, sharper, and far more enduring. Imagine a woman in a smoke-filled hall, her voice cutting through the arguments of chieftains as she dictated clauses ensuring wives could divorce abusive husbands and daughters could inherit farmland. This wasn't just reform, it was a seismic shift in a world where power usually flowed through sword arms. Un's laws reveal a sophistication that defies Viking stereotypes. She didn't just grant divorce rights, she structured them with meticulous fairness. If a woman sought separation, her dowry was returned in full, plus interest for any livestock or grain she'd contributed to the household. Sons and daughters split inheritances equally, a radical concept when most of Europe favored male primogeniture. But her boldest stroke was establishing the woman's oath, allowing female witnesses to testify without male guardians, a provision that later influenced Iceland's Althing, the world's oldest parliament. Archaeologists digging at Thingvellir, the assembly site, have found rune stones bearing phrases like "as Un decreed," buried beneath layers where later laws were attributed solely to male lawmakers. Why did history try to bury her? The answer lies in parchment and prejudice. When Christian scribes centuries later transcribed Iceland's legal codes, they quietly reassigned credit to male contemporaries like Ulfljótur. A 13th century manuscript even claims Ulfljótur brought laws from Norway, ignoring Un's earlier, distinctly Icelandic reforms. The irony: those same scribes preserved the truth in snippets, accidentally quoting her exact phrasing while stripping her name from the record. It's as if her voice echoes through the vellum, refusing to be silenced. Modern scholars piecing together her story face a tantalizing puzzle. Land registry records show farms held by women in Un's lifetime suddenly vanish from later documents, only to reappear under male names. A saga passage describing her settling disputes with the wisdom of Frigg was later amended to credit a male Godi or chieftain. Even her nickname, Deep-Minded, was sanitized in some texts to imply mysticism rather than legal brilliance. But the sagas, those stubborn keepers of oral history, wouldn't let her fade entirely. In the Laxdæla saga, a widow invokes Un's right to reclaim her dowry, proving the laws outlived their creator's erasure. What makes Un's story vital isn't just the injustice, it's how her pragmatism shaped democracy itself. Her focus on concrete details over grand pronouncements, how much butter constituted a fair divorce settlement, which landmarks defined grazing boundaries, created a legal culture rooted in everyday fairness. When the Althing convened in 930, its procedures echoed her methods, evidence over brute force, compromise over conquest. Today, as Iceland celebrates its parliamentary heritage, Un's fingerprints are there in the quiet spaces between clauses, in the unbroken thread of a woman's insistence that even in the age of axes, words could be mightier. Agnes of Poitou stood alone in the snow outside Canossa Castle in 1076, but this time the roles were reversed. 50 years earlier, Emperor Henry IV had knelt there begging Pope Gregory VII for forgiveness. Now it was Agnes, regent of the Holy Roman Empire, facing excommunication for defending her 11-year-old son's throne. The papal bull condemning her crackled in her grip, its Latin phrases branding her a viper in the bosom of Mother Church. Most rulers would have crumpled. Agnes burned it publicly, tossing the ashes into the winter wind as her knights roared approval. This wasn't just defiance, it was a mother declaring war to protect her child's birthright. Her battle began with an impossible choice. When her husband Henry III died suddenly in 1056, leaving the empire vulnerable, Agnes could have followed tradition, remarry a powerful duke to secure protection, surrendering control to a new husband. Instead, she gambled everything on autonomy, ruling as sole regent for young Henry IV. At first, the nobility tolerated her as a temporary placeholder. But when she began appointing common-born advisors for their competence rather than noble blood, the backlash turned vicious. Archbishop Anno of Cologne kidnapped Henry during a riverboat picnic, forcing Agnes to either abdicate or risk her son's safety. Church chronicles paint her surrender as weakness. They omit what happened next. Agnes spent the next decade waging the empire's first shadow regency. From her estates in Bavaria, she built a network of lower clergy and minor nobles, men overlooked by the arrogant archbishops now controlling Henry. Slowly, she turned imperial bureaucracy into her weapon. Tax collectors coincidentally audited rebel nobles' lands. Roads leading to Anno's territories mysteriously fell into disrepair. When Henry came of age in 1065, he didn't need to reclaim power. His mother had never truly lost it. The real explosion came over investiture. As Pope and Emperor clashed over who could appoint bishops, Agnes made her stand. She backed her son's right to rule against papal overreach, knowing surrender would make him a puppet. The Vatican's retaliation was brutal. Pope Gregory stripped her titles, forbade priests from giving her communion, and ordered her own son to shun her as spiritually dead. Yet Agnes's letters from this period reveal not despair but cold calculation. She funneled imperial silver to reformist cardinals opposing Gregory, weakening him from within. She even exploited the Pope's own weapon, excommunicating Anno and his allies under imperial decree, a stunning reversal of church authority. Contemporary accounts describe her riding through blizzards to besieged castles, personally negotiating with garrison commanders while snow crusted her cloak. Later church historians would vilify her as the she-wolf of Rome, blaming her for the investiture controversy's bloodshed. But recently uncovered treasury rolls tell a different story. Payments to monastic scribes prove Agnes commissioned copies of canon law, not to defy it, but to outmaneuver the Pope on legal grounds. Her personal gospel book, preserved in a Swiss monastery, contains marginal notes dissecting papal bulls with razor precision. This wasn't rebellion for its own sake. It was a masterclass in constitutional resistance, the cruelest twist Agnes won. By the time she died in 1077, Henry ruled unchallenged, the investiture conflict tipping in his favor. But victory came at a cost only mothers understand. Her final letter, penned days before her death, never reached Henry, intercepted by bishops who feared its contents. Centuries later, archivists found it wedged behind a library shelf, its ink still legible. "Forgive me for the wars I waged in your name, my son. A crown defended is heavier than one won." The parchment was worn thin where fingers had traced the words, perhaps Henry's own after he finally held it. Agnes's legacy isn't just in the battles she fought, it's in the blueprint she left for resisting tyranny without becoming monstrous. Where male rulers faced excommunication with armies, she countered with laws and ledgers. Modern constitutions guaranteeing separation of church and state owe silent debts to her stubborn refusal to let either sphere dominate the other. And in the quiet of Bavarian convents she endowed, nuns still light candles for the regent who proved that sometimes the most sacred act is telling even God's vicar no. The Silk Road wasn't just a path for spices and silk. It was a web of power, and in the 12th century, its threads all led to one woman's hands. Turkan Khatun didn't just inherit wealth, she built an empire of information disguised as trade. Picture her caravans winding through the Pamir Mountains, camels laden with Persian saffron, Chinese porcelain, and something far more valuable, scrolls detailing every warlord's weakness, every oasis garrison's loyalty, every tax collector's price. While kings fought over borders, Turkan controlled the flow of knowledge, and in the medieval world, that made her richer than any vault of gold. Her genius lay in turning commerce into covert operations. Merchant guilds doubled as intelligence networks, their ledgers written in code. A shipment of Samarkand melons might hide reports on Mongol troop movements. A crate of Kashmiri shawls could conceal maps of secret mountain passes. When rival rulers demanded tariffs, Turkan's agents paid, then strategically leaked their financial records to spark rebellions among their overtaxed subjects. Venetian traders who thought they were dealing with a mere queen found themselves outmaneuvered, their own letters to Europe intercepted and rewritten by her scribes before reaching their destinations. But Turkan's true power wasn't just in gathering secrets, it was in weaponizing silence. When the Khwarezmian Empire sought to conquer her territories, they discovered critical roads suddenly closed for repairs, their scouts vanishing without traces. Supply caravans meant for enemy armies arrived spoiled, their contents mysteriously swapped for worthless stones. Contemporary chroniclers attributed these misfortunes to bad luck, never suspecting the woman who sat weaving tapestries in her Nishapur palace, each thread a metaphor for the alliances she pulled taut or severed with a flick of her wrist. The greatest blow came when her enemies finally breached her walls. They expected hordes of treasure. Instead, they found empty scriptoriums, the ashes of her archives still warm. Turkan had ordered her life's work burned rather than let rivals pass her methods. For centuries, historians assumed little survived until a 1980s excavation in Uzbekistan uncovered a single intact chest beneath a caravanserai's ruins. Inside, fragments of ledgers using a cipher now recognized as an early form of double-entry bookkeeping, alongside lists of gifts to officials that matched exactly with their subsequent political shifts. Modern economists analyzing these fragments made a startling realization. Turkan hadn't just bribed power players, she'd created the medieval equivalent of a futures market, betting on rebellions before they happened. A payment to a minor garrison commander in 1192, for example, preceded his defection during a siege by 3 months. Her spies weren't just observers, They were catalysts nudging events toward outcomes that would profit her network. The Silk Road's most valuable commodity wasn't silk at all, it was the certainty of what came next. Yet for all her foresight, Turcan couldn't prevent her own erasure. The Mongols, who later devastated the region, systematically purged mentions of her from surviving records, uncomfortable with the precedent of a woman outsmarting empires. Persian poets reduced her to a stock character, the merchant's greedy widow, while European maps labeled her former territories simply as Tartary, blank spaces where a kingdom ought to be. Only in the oral traditions of caravan drivers did whispers persist, stories of a queen who could read the desert winds like ledger lines and the stars like market trends. Today, as historians cross-reference these fragments, a Chinese customs report here, a Georgian monk's diary entry there, Turcan silhouette emerges from the ashes. Her real monument isn't in stone or parchment, but in the unbroken rhythm of commerce itself. Every time a modern trader hedges a bet or a diplomat reads between the lines of a treaty, they're walking the path she paved, the invisible road where information is the ultimate currency, and the sharpest minds write history in margins too faint for conquerors to see. The ink on Helena Palaiologina's final letter was still damp when the Ottoman cannons breached Constantinople's walls in 1453. While history remembers Sultan Mehmed's triumph and Emperor Constantine's heroic last stand, the desperate diplomacy of Byzantium's last empress has faded into obscurity. Yet her correspondence, hidden for centuries in Venetian archives, reveals a woman who fought not with swords, but with words sharp enough to pierce the apathy of Europe. Helena didn't just send pleas for aid, she crafted geopolitical masterpieces, offering the Vatican something more valuable than gold: the chance to heal the great schism that had split Christendom for 400 years. Her strategy was as bold as it was heartbreaking. Knowing Latin princes wouldn't rally for Greek orthodoxy, she framed Constantinople's fall as Rome's coming catastrophe. To the Doge of Venice, she detailed Ottoman shipbuilding techniques that would soon threaten Mediterranean trade. To King Alfonso of Aragon, she sent maps showing how Turkish control of the Bosporus would strangle European commerce. But her most brilliant appeal was to Pope Nicholas V, a promise to reunite the Eastern and Western churches if he mobilized crusaders. This wasn't empty flattery. Helena had secretly coached Orthodox bishops to accept papal supremacy, risking riots in Constantinople's streets to make the offer credible. The replies, when they came, were dripping with hollow condolences. Cardinal Bessarion's frantic memos to Italian bankers proved the Empress's arguments were sound. Europe simply chose profit over survival. Venetian ledgers show ships laden with grain diverting from Constantinople to safer ports as the siege intensified. Even Helena's final, furious missive to the Holy Roman Emperor survives, its acid-laced Latin translating roughly to, "When you hear the Muezzin's call echoing through your cathedrals, remember you had the power to stop it." After the fall, Helena's name was systematically erased. Ottoman chroniclers ignored her to glorify Mehmed's victory. Christian scribes, ashamed of their inaction, recast the tragedy as inevitable divine punishment. But in the twilight years of Byzantium, she'd achieved something extraordinary for a few fleeting months. Her negotiations had actually worked. The papal envoy Isidore of Kiev arrived with 200 archers funded by her promises. Geno's mercenaries held the seawalls longer than expected, bought with her diplomatic IOUs. Even Mehmed himself, upon reading captured letters years later, reportedly kept one as a curiosity, a testament to the woman who'd almost outmaneuvered him with parchment and sealing wax. Today, historians sifting through the Vatican's Archivio Segreto have uncovered marginal notes in Nicholas V's hand. Were she a man, we might have heeded her. The bitter truth, Helena's greatest obstacle wasn't Ottoman gunpowder or European greed. It was the medieval world's refusal to believe a woman's mind could read the tides of history. Her letters, now yellowed with age, remain as both indictment and inspiration, proof that brilliance needs no crown to shine, only the courage to speak truth as the walls come crashing down. These women were never anomalies, they were threads in a vast, unbroken tapestry of female leadership that history tried to unravel. What made them dangerous wasn't just their crowns or swords, but the undeniable proof they left behind, that governance, diplomacy, and conquest have never been the sole domain of men. Their erasure wasn't accidental, it was systematic. Chroniclers minimized them, rivals slandered them, and later historians buried them under layers of myth, all because their very existence undermined the lie that power has a gender. Think about what it means to rediscover them now. When we read of Raisia al-Din abolishing taxes for starving farmers, or Turkan Kot outmaneuvering empires with her Silk Road intelligence network, we're not just learning about individuals, we're witnessing the cracks in centuries of propaganda. These rulers exposed the flimsiness of arguments once used to bar women from voting, owning property, or holding office. How could anyone claim women lacked political genius when Theodora of Byzantium rebuilt an empire through scholarship, or when Enzinga of Ndongo held colonial powers at bay for decades? Their stories don't just belong in the past, they're mirrors reflecting the biases we still wrestle with today. This isn't about swapping one set of heroes for another. It's about recognizing that history, as we've inherited it, is an edited manuscript with entire chapters scissored out. The moment we accept that Jadwiga of Poland could be both a saint and a military strategist, or that Agnes of Poitou could defy popes while drafting constitutional law, we start seeing the gaps everywhere. Whose voices are missing from the narratives of the Industrial Revolution, the space race, the digital age? The same forces that silenced these rulers didn't stop working in the Middle Ages. But here's the thrilling part, the story isn't finished. Every time archaeologists dust off a new ledger like Matilda of Tuscany's banking records, or linguists decode a forgotten poem by Jahan Cotton, we're stitching history back together. These women don't need our approval, they're long past caring what we think. What they offer us is far more valuable, the chance to reimagine what's possible. If a pirate queen like Grace O'Malley could negotiate as equals with Elizabeth I, if a scholar like Lubna of Cordoba could shape the Renaissance centuries before it reached Europe, what might we achieve once we stop believing the old limits? So let's not just applaud their legacy, let's continue it. Share the names that stunned you. Debate whether Melisend's cultural diplomacy or Isabella of Armenia's battlefield brilliance was more revolutionary. And most importantly, ask whose stories still lie buried in archives, waiting for their chance to rewrite what we thought we knew. History isn't a static record, it's a conversation, and thanks to these 25 rulers, we've just scratched the surface of what there is to say. Press subscribe because this isn't the end of the journey. It's the first step into a past far richer, stranger, and more inspiring than we ever imagined. The next revelation, it might be waiting in your comment, your research, or the dusty corner of an overlooked manuscript. Let's find it together.